incident was about to take place that would shake the foundations of the civilized world.
It is time to open your mind. Time to discover your divine self as we navigate this holographic matrix together. Strap in, cosmic family, as we slide through this wormhole of cosmic information together in search of the truth.
You can't handle the truth.
It's time to go inside the matrix. With your host, Jimmy Brent.
Okay, welcome to the show, everybody. Welcome to Inside the Matrix, where we all require an open mind and a large dose of curiosity to help us get through this maze of trying to figure out what the heck is happening in this world and what the heck has happened in the world. Anyway, with that said, my guest today is Steve Cameron. Steve is a writer, director, producer, and public speaker from Los Angeles, California. He's worked both behind and in front of the camera since 1996. He began his television career covering news and sports in his hometown of Detroit, Michigan, where he also worked on many local independent film productions. In 2000, Steve relocated to Los Angeles and began working on films, television shows, commercials, and web-based content as a writer, producer, director, and as an actor on various films and television shows such as The Mentalist and CSI. In 2016, Steve produced a documentary called The Roger Craig Story, concerning JFK assassination witness and former Dallas deputy sheriff Roger Dean Craig, who reported numerous events that occurred in Dealey Plaza on November 22, 1963, that dramatically contradict the Warren Commission's conclusions of what happened that day. In 1975, Roger Craig was found shot to death under very mysterious circumstances shortly before he was able to testify to staff members of the House Select Committee on Assassinations, who were in the process of reopening the case. Steve wrote a book about Roger Craig's life called The Deputy Interviews, and that's available on stevecameronproductions.com. Steve is currently producing an upcoming feature film about Deputy Roger Craig with fellow filmmaker Steven Seffer called The Deputy. Steve, welcome to the show.
Hi, Jimmy. Thanks for having me.
Great to have you on. And we were talking a little bit earlier about our friend John Barber, who's also shed a lot of light on what happened the day that JFK was assassinated. And I heard an interview with you a while back, and I was very intrigued by the information that you brought forward from Deputy Craig. So before we get into all that, though, would you mind going back and kind of giving our listeners an idea of where you came from, how you got on this path of finding the truth and trying to bring it forward in life?
Yeah, sure. First off, I just want to thank you for having me on today. I really appreciate it. And thanks to everybody out there that's listening right now. Thanks for sharing part of your day with me. And this, what I think is a very important story about one of America's greatest unsung heroes, Roger Dean Craig. We'll get into all that. But I guess as far as my path concerning the JFK assassination, probably like, most people, I grew up in a time where I went to school and, the teachers, they taught me that, the president was assassinated by one person named Lee Harvey Oswald. End of story. That was it. That was basically all we got. And around 1988, 1990, I was flipping through, television stations, and I think I landed on the History Channel. And there was a documentary on the History Channel called The Men Who Killed Kennedy. And as I watched it, I couldn't believe my ears and my eyes and what I was seeing, because I had never heard any of this information before, at least not to that extent. With witnesses, it was a documentary, and they interviewed several experts, and I just sat there with my jaw, open and my mouth open. I couldn't believe it. And as I was watching it, my dad walked into the room, and he, was just standing there over my shoulder and watching it with me. And then after a couple of minutes, he told me to turn that crap off, is basically what his exact words were. And I couldn't believe it. I thought I did something wrong. I didn't know what. And, I asked him, I said, Dad, what's wrong? What's going on? And he's like, I'll never believe that my government had anything to do with that. And I don't want you to believe it either. And he stormed out of the room. And that was pretty much the end of it. So I turned off the TV, and then maybe a year or two later, I saw Oliver Stone's film, JFK. Mm-hmm. And that opened up a lot more doors to information that I was never had ever seen. And that movie and The Men Who Killed Kennedy pretty much, opened my eyes to the whole JFK assassination not being a lone nut, pulled off by one person, which, now that I look back on it, it's just completely ridiculous. Yeah, that's how I started upon that information. Yeah.
And of course, we know that the official version of most everything that occurs is, including things like 9/11, are complete fabrications and, total BS. It's really sad that we live in a world like that. And when you come to that realization, you realize that, we have people in very high places who are evil. I don't know how else to describe them. That's just where it's at.
Well, yeah, I agree with you. But evil can mean a lot of things. The field mouse thinks that the cat's evil, but I definitely understand what you're saying. There are evil people, but I think maybe they're greedy is what they are. And a lot of it is about money and is about power and, not caring about other people. So yeah, I guess that's a good definition for evil.
Yeah, I would say so. All right. So let's, how did you end up coming across Roger's information? Deputy Roger Craig.
Okay. Yeah. So around the year 2012, I had a tragedy in my family, like a lot of people have. Family members die and that kind of thing. Mine was a little different. It was a little unusual. My mom passed away on March 28th, 2012. And about 10 days later, my father was found shot to death from an apparent suicide. And that's what it was ruled officially. And as these things happen, over time, information starts coming out. And I found out that my father had defensive wounds in his hands. He had bullet wounds in his hands. And it's okay. I'm okay with talking about this, just so you know. So if you have any questions, feel free to. I've had a lot of time to heal. Mm-hmm. But it's still very fresh with me.
Of course.
Yeah. And so I found out that my father was shot in his hands. He had bullet wounds in his chest. He was shot in his face. And the coroner quickly wrapped it up and called it a suicide. And at the time, I thought, maybe, possibly, I don't know. I mean, it sounds more amazing than the magic bullet theory, to be honest with you. It killed Kennedy, supposedly. Mm-hmm. And me and another family member, we discussed these things, and we started to think that there was something more to it. And at that time, it was kind of difficult for me to even process what had happened. Sure. And if people out there that have lost family members or people that are close, you get tunnel vision, and it's not a good place to be. And so at that time, it was hard for me to face it, I guess you could say. But in my own way, I started researching mysterious suicides, suspicious deaths, and things of that nature. And I came across Roger Craig, Deputy Sheriff Roger Craig. and he was also a witness in Dealey Plaza during the assassination of our 35th president, John F. Kennedy. And I found out that his death had also been ruled a suicide under very mysterious circumstances in 1975. During your introduction of me, you mentioned some of that he actually had a scheduled interview with Robert Groden, who at the time was a staff member for Congressman Thomas Downing of Virginia, his investigation of reopening the John F. Kennedy assassination and the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. Mm-hmm. And they were in the very early stages of that. And Downing wanted to get Roger's story on record, and he had sent Robert Groden down to interview him. Robert was on a plane with his wife, and he landed at Love Field in Dallas. And when he got off the plane, he was met by Penn Jones. If many of your listeners may or may not be familiar with Penn Jones, but he is a prolific John F. Kennedy, first generation John F. Kennedy author. And he knew Roger Craig. He also worked for Jim Garrison's case during the 60s when Jim Garrison had put Clay Shaw on trial for participating in a conspiracy to kill Kennedy. Right. So Robert Groden was met there at the airport by Penn Jones, J. Gary Shaw, who was also another first generation author and researcher of the case, as well as Larry Harris, who had met Robert Groden there. And they gave Robert Groden the bad news that Roger was dead. So Roger, and then they went pretty much straight from there over to the funeral home where there was being a service held for Roger at the time. Uh-huh. And so he never got a chance to talk to him. And this is all covered in my book, The Deputy Interviews. I interview both J. Gary Shaw and Robert Groden in the book. And J. Gary Shaw was very close, a confidant of Roger Craig, and he knew him. And the people that I interviewed for this book either were very close to the case or knew Roger personally, family members. And so anyway, back to your question, I found Roger's information and I kind of just threw myself into that story. And I guess the reason why his information came across because I was searching Google and things for suspicious suicides, and their algorithms probably pulled up some of my other JFK research that I was, doing or in the middle of, and and I found it was an interview. I believe the interview originally, Mark Lane was putting a documentary together called 2 Men in Dallas. Back in the 1970s, and it was I think a 2-hour documentary all about Roger Craig and what he witnessed and why he was such an important witness to the case, and what he went through because of it, for telling his story and telling the truth and trying to expose what happened there in Dealey Plaza. And unfortunately, he was rewarded by having his life destroyed over it. So I threw myself into his story, and I wanted to find out as much information that I could about him. And I was finding a lot of truths and untruths on the internet, a lot of positive things and then some bad things, like everybody that you research has some, somebody wants to discredit them and say what, how bad a person they are or whatever. Oh, yeah. 99% of the information that I was finding out about this man was true. But I still wanted to go to the source and find out from the people closest to him who he was and what he saw, what he went through. And so I started reaching out to family members who had an online presence, and they were talking about Roger Craig and his case and things like that. So I eventually found a phone number for his son, Roger Craig Jr., and I contacted Roger and I told him, hey, I'm very interested in your father's case. I'm friends actually with a few people out here in Hollywood, and we wanted to possibly turn your father's story into a feature film. And that's how I approached Roger in the beginning. And pretty much after I said that, he said, not interested, and he hung up on me. After probably almost, well over a year trying to find out contact information for him or for, people that were close to Roger. And so I was like, oh man, I came this far. Okay, I'm gonna call him one more time. And then if he still doesn't want to talk to me, that's pretty much the end of it. I'm not going to bother him again. So I called him right back. I said, please, sir, just listen to what I have to say for a minute, if you don't mind. I'm a great admirer of your father. And I told him a little bit about my story and what happened with my dad and how it kind of related to me on a personal level. And I wanted to get to the truth about what happened to his dad. And he said, you know what, Steve, I've been thinking a lot about my father lately, and sure, I'll talk to you. And so we had a nice conversation over the phone. And then about a week later, I flew to Dallas and I met with him in person. And just to see him face to face and tell me about his father, it was just an experience that I'll always be thankful for. And meeting him and meeting other members of his family, Roger Craig's granddaughter, and her family, and Roger Craig's sister-in-law, Deanie Wood. I interviewed her for the book as well. Her family has been so supportive of my work. And they just want to get Roger's story out there to the world. Yes. That's pretty much the genesis of that story, and why I became involved with Roger, and why I decided to write this book about his life, The Deputy Interviews.
It's hard to fathom, I think, for a lot of people. And your dad was an example when he reacted to that show you were watching. People don't want to believe that there's this kind of, this structure of what many refer to as the deep state operating within our government, in our government, around our government, through our government. It's like government is actually some kind of a facade and a group of talking heads who aren't really doing a whole lot about actually running the country or helping the people. And so it takes people like yourself that are willing to stand up and tell the truth about what's going on, and people like Roger Craig Jr., who is also willing to come forward. And I'm going to let everybody know right now, in a second hour, we're going to bring Roger Dean Craig Jr. on the show with us. He's agreed to speak with us a bit too, so I'm very excited about that. But we have to stand up. We have to stand up and tell the truth. This is the time. We can't wait any longer. These people have entrenched themselves into positions of power, and they're doing things to our country and to us that are just unconscionable, and we have to stand up. And eventually, if enough of us do, we can put a stop to this kind of thing.
Well, yeah, thank you, Jimmy, and thanks to you and people like you that have these type of broadcasts that bring truth to the world. And so that is so refreshing to be able to have these platforms to be able to come on and talk about these type of things. Who knows where we'll be in another 5-10 years? I mean, it's starting to look really scary with a lot of the censorship and things like that are happening with our media. But what you said, look, everybody out there listening, I mean, we only have one life. We only have one life to live, okay? We're only here for a certain amount of years, and it's about what we put into it. And what are you going to do with your life? Mm-hmm. Is the truth important to you? Is freedom important to you? And, I'm sure everybody's heard about it at this point, and, I don't want to go off on a tangent about what happened today with Kobe Bryant. Did you hear the news about Kobe?
Yes, I did.
And
that always makes me wonder, too.
Well, I know exactly probably what you're talking about. I mean, the man was worth a lot of money. Who knows? But at this point, whatever happened, I mean, he's gone. And so is his daughter. I believe one of his daughters was on that helicopter. And, he woke up. You think when he woke up today, he knew that was going to happen? I don't.
No, I doubt it very seriously.
And none of us do. And none of us know when that day and time is going to come. So whatever you do with your life, whatever's important to you, get out there and do it, or the best that you can.
Yeah. And I totally agree with that. Steve, and I think a lot of us are doing that. And, we're stepping up our game along the same time as the dark side is stepping up theirs and, trying to do things like censorship and all that. But it's going to come down to, how many people do have a strong moral compass and want to live by it. So with that in mind, let's get back to, Roger's story. And let's talk about a couple of things that happened on the day of the assassination and what he witnessed that was in direct contradiction to the official Warren report.
Sure. Yeah, where would you like to start?
I mean, we can't get too far into it. We've only got about 4 minutes before the first break, but let's just get started on that, and we'll
Sure.
keep it going after the break.
Yeah, so I'll give you a little bit of background on Roger first, if that's okay.
Yeah, that's great.
Okay, yeah. So he was born in 1936 in Minnesota, and then I believe his family moved to Wisconsin. He grew up on a farm, I believe, in Wisconsin. He had a very bad home life, and at the age of, I think it was 13 or 14, he hopped on a freight train and took a freight train to Montana, and he worked on a ranch there for a year or two, and he decided that he didn't want to do that anymore, and so he, at the age of 15, used his older brother, Donald, he used his name to register for the U.S. Army, and and so he entered into the United States Army at the age of 15. He went through basic, and then he was put on a base less than a mile from his older brother, Donald, who was already in the military. And he was caught. He was caught by his superior, and they were both called in together. And they sent the younger Donald home, which was Roger Craig. And at the age of 17, he was drafted, and he was sent over to Korea. And during his wartime in Korea, he was captured by the Red Chinese. He was a POW for a certain amount of time. He was tortured. They tried to get information out of him. And he was eventually broken out by the military out of that camp and rescued. He was honorably discharged from the U.S. Army at that time, I believe. And then he relocated to Dallas, where his mother and father had moved to Dallas because his father took a job at a factory down there in Dallas. Mm-hmm. And during that time, he met a woman named Juanita. They had a child, and that's Roger Jr. And you mentioned him earlier. You're going to have him on the show. And yep. So they had it was Juanita, and they had a child, Roger Jr. And then at that time, Roger was looking for work around 1959. And he had a friend that worked in dispatch over at the Dallas Sheriff's Office. And he said that he could get Roger in there. And so Roger went down there to take the physical, and he didn't pass it because he couldn't make weight. So he was, at that time, very skinny and very poor at that time as well. And his buddy at the dispatch office said, "Look, next time you come in to take the physical, just eat 10 pounds of bananas." And
yeah. All right. Steve, I hate to cut you off. We'll continue this right after the break. We're coming up on it. You're listening to Inside the Matrix with our guest, Steve Cameron. We're going to continue our story in just a little bit after these messages. All right, welcome back, everybody, to Inside the Matrix with our guest, Steve Cameron. And before the break, Steve was telling us about Roger Craig's trying to get on the sheriff's department, but he had trouble making weight. So what was the next step there, Steve?
Yeah. So Roger, he takes his buddy's advice down at dispatch at the sheriff's office, and he eats 10 pounds of bananas. And Roger Jr., he tells me the story. So I interviewed Roger Jr. for the book, and he tells the story in the book, The Deputy Interviews, which, if it's okay right now, Jimmy, I'd like to make an announcement. And this is actually, this just occurred today. And so your listeners are getting pretty much the first notice of it. My book has now been accepted on Amazon. It's available on Amazon, and it can be found if you go to Amazon.com. Just put in the search box there, The Deputy Interviews, and you will find a link to a paperback and also a Kindle version as well. The paperback is more expensive than the Kindle version. The Kindle is selling for, I think, $9.99, and the book itself is selling for $24.99. And also, I'm still selling the book on my website, stevecameronproductions.com. And if you go into the shop, and if you purchase the book, I have it listed there for $35. But for your listeners today, Jimmy, I made a special coupon code that they can purchase the book at a $10 discount, bringing it to $25, around the same price as on Amazon. And all they got to do is put the coupon code Inside the Matrix, all one word, Inside the Matrix, and put that coupon code in there at checkout, and they'll get a $10 discount. And all of the books that I sell on my website, I inscribe them, and I give I sign all the books to everyone that buys one. And I want to thank everyone who has supported my effort to get this story out to the world. Thank you so much. I couldn't have done it without your help. And thank you to all the people that have already purchased a copy. So that said, I'll pick up the story where we left off. So Roger eats 10 pounds of bananas, and and he goes over, he gets on the scale, and he makes weight, and he spends, I think, a year. New deputies had to spend a year in dispatch. That's what Roger Jr. told me. And Roger Jr. himself also he followed in his father's footsteps and became a Dallas deputy sheriff as well for a number of years. And so his dad spent about a year in dispatch. And then during his first year out in the field, he apprehended an international jewel thief he spotted. I think he had spotted him from a wanted poster or something like that, because this person, his name was Harry Day. It was a hairy day for Harry Day, because Roger Craig spotted him and casing these jewelry stores, and they apprehended him. And for that, Roger Craig won Officer of the Year award for 1960. Wow. For that apprehension of that international jewel thief. So Roger Craig at that time in 1960, 1961, 1962, all the way up to 1963, he was a very respected lawman in Dallas. He was well liked in his community. Everybody loved him, from everybody that I've spoken to that knew him. And then everything changed on November 22nd, 1963. And we can get into that if you'd like to at this time, unless you have some follow-up questions.
No, that's good. Let's jump in there.
Okay, so November 22nd, it was a Friday in 1963. The president was coming to town, John F. Kennedy, with his wife, Jacqueline Kennedy. And there was a parade that was coming through Dallas. The president's plane, he had spoken, I think he was in Fort Worth, and then they flew into Dallas Love Field. And they were to drive through Dallas and a place called Dealey Plaza on their way to, I believe it was, he was McCormick Center. He was going to speak. He was going to give a big speech there in Dallas. And Roger Craig, working for the sheriff's office, when he went into work that day, Sheriff Bill Decker addressed all of his deputies, and he said, look, you are not to take part in that motorcade whatsoever. And he ordered them to dress in plain clothes and just stand in front of the sheriff's office, which was located at 505 Main Street in Dealey Plaza, just right around the corner from where Kennedy was assassinated. And so Roger was outside in a suit, and representing the sheriff's office out there on Main Street. He was at the corner of Main Street in Houston. The president's limo, it drove past. He saw the president wave. They turned the corner onto Houston, and it made that left turn onto Elm Street right in front of the school book depository. And just as it got past the school book depository, approximately 100 yards, the shot started ringing out. Roger Craig heard the shot, sprung into action, ran directly towards the limousine, and witnessed the limousine as it sped underneath the triple underpass and on its way to Parkland Hospital, where the president was later announced deceased. At that time, Roger Craig followed police officers who were going into the rail yard behind the picket fence that was on top of the grassy knoll. He followed officers over that fence. He immediately saw a woman in a brown Chevy attempting to drive away and out of the parking lot. Now, this is a parking lot that was reserved for deputies who worked for the courthouse, and they all had to pay money, and there was a gate that that with a lock on it to only allow these deputies to park in this lot. And so when Roger saw this woman that he'd never seen before fleeing the scene, he jumped in front of her car and immediately arrested her and said that she wasn't going anywhere. She said, she's like, I have to leave. He said, you're under arrest. You're not going anywhere. And at that time, another officer named Deputy Lewis came over and told Roger, he had more seniority than Roger. I think Deputy Lewis was about 35 at that time, and Roger was approximately 27. And for whatever reason, Roger decided to turn her over to Deputy Lewis. And the reason why I say that is because there is no official report of this arrest ever happening of this woman.
Wow.
Yeah. So, and Roger, he tells this story, and this is all in my book. Now, Roger Craig, one of the things that I didn't mention, after I found his interview, and it was in a documentary called Evidence of Revision. So for the people out there listening, if you want to find Roger Craig's interview from 1974, a year before I believe he was murdered, and it was covered up to look like a suicide, he did an interview with a man named Lincoln Carl, and it's been picked up in several documentaries, including mine, called JFK Assassination, the Roger Dean Craig story. And his interview is in there, and he lays it all out, every detail about what he witnessed that day. And it is all in my book as well, the deputy interviews. And I also reprinted a manuscript that Roger Craig wrote in 1971, but he never was able to get it published. And I bought the rights to it through his son, and I published it in my book, The Deputy Interview. So that Roger Craig's complete manuscript of everything that he witnessed and what he went through is in my book as well. And so after he turned this woman over to Deputy Lewis, he went over to the picket fence on top of the grassy knoll, and there were people there saying shots came from that area. Now, for your listeners, many of them already, they know a lot of this information that I'm already saying, but for the people that don't, the grassy knoll area where this picket fence was west of the school book depository, approximately 100 yards. And behind this picket fence area, witnesses, and that's one of the reasons why police were running behind this picket fence, because witnesses were telling them shots came from that area, nowhere near the school book depository. And when Roger walked up to the fence and by the grassy knoll, he ran into a couple of witnesses, Arnold Rowland and his wife, who were spectators there in Dealey Plaza while the president's limousine drove through there. And they told Roger Craig that about 10 minutes before the motorcade passed through there, they saw two men on the 6th floor of the school book depository with guns. But they didn't think anything suspicious because they just thought it was part of the president's security detail. And that's what they told Roger Craig. And the Rowlands never changed their story about this either, even though the Warren Commission and other people that have tried to cover this assassination up over the years have tried to discredit them. But the Rowlands have always stuck to their story that they saw two men up there with guns, one in the east window and one in the west window of the school book depository.
What floor?
The 6th floor.
Okay.
And so Roger Craig, as he's interviewing them, once again, Deputy Lewis comes over and tells Roger Craig that he's going to take the Rowlands off of their hands and take them over to the sheriff's office and get their statements. And so Roger turned the Rowlands over to Deputy Lewis. And at that time, he saw one of his fellow deputies, and you asked about if any other deputies had come forward. This is another man. His name was Deputy Sheriff Buddy Walders. He saw Deputy Buddy Walders across the street examining the curb area on the south side of Elm Street. For people listening, if you're familiar with that area, there was a manhole cover And this would have been, so imagine if you're shooting at the president from President Kennedy now. If you're shooting from at President Kennedy from the grassy knoll as his limousine's passing by, on the other side of the limousine is the south side of Elm Street. Now, this is the curb area. So the Kennedy would have been in between the grassy knoll and this curb when his limo passed through there. And so Buddy Walters is examining this area with another officer, an officer by the name of J.W. Foster. Now, J.W. Foster first saw this, it was like a manhole grate on the south side of Elm Street there, and he's examining it. And he told Buddy Walters, I found where a bullet hit. And there's pictures of it too, and you can see it. There's a scuff mark where a bullet had hit that the grate of that manhole cover, and had bounced out and like landed in the grassy area. And they were examining that area, and there was blood and the way they described it, brain matter and things like that from the president's head. Oh. And so Roger goes across the street to see what's going on, and he sees them examining it, and Buddy tells Roger Craig that he found a bullet in the grass. And they're examining it, and as Buddy Walters is telling him this, Roger Craig hears this, how he described it, a shrill whistle. And he looked over in the direction of the schoolbook depository, and he saw a man running from the front of the schoolbook depository down the grassy embankment there, and get picked up by another man driving a Nash Rambler station wagon. It was a light-colored Nash Rambler station wagon. And they were trying to pull out into traffic, and Roger thought this was suspicious because everybody was going to the scene, and these were pretty much the only two people trying to get away from the scene, besides the woman that he saw in the parking lot earlier. Mm-hmm. And so he tried to catch them because he wanted to arrest them and question them. Why were they running from the schoolbook depository like that? And he went to go cross the street, but the traffic, he said, it was too thick and he couldn't get across the street, and the car sped away and before he could get the license plate. But he got the what state it was from and the color of it. And he also said that this station wagon was driving toward Oak Cliff. Now, if you're familiar with Oak Cliff, that's where Officer J.D. Tippit was found shot to death. Now, President Kennedy was killed at approximately 12:30 p.m. And Officer Tippit, now, this is where things get, it depends on who you want to believe. The Warren Commission says that Officer Tippit was shot at 1:25 p.m. And that would have given Oswald enough time to travel from the schoolbook depository back to his rooming house, and then to the scene of the Tippit shooting, where Tippit was found killed. We'll go back to that because I'm skipping a little bit ahead in the story. So after Roger Craig tries to stop these two men fleeing the scene in the Rambler station wagon, not too long after that, and that was about at 12:40 p.m., somebody starts shouting out the sixth floor depository window and said, "Here it is." And it was a police officer that had found the so-called sniper's nest there in the sixth floor. And so officers started going into the into the schoolbook depository at that point. And Roger Craig was one of them. They followed other officers up the back staircase, and they went to the sixth floor. And then Roger Craig went to the window where that officer was yelling, and he walked into what they call the sniper's nest. And he looked down on the ground, and he saw 3 holes. Now, these were 3 shells from the weapon that was supposedly fired to kill Kennedy. And Roger Craig said that all 3 shells were laying side by side, no more than an inch apart, all facing the same direction. Okay.
As if somebody placed them there.
Exactly.
Yeah. Exactly.
So anybody out there that's ever shot a gun, they know that that's ridiculous.
Yeah.
And so he, at that time, it was actually Luke Mooney who is credited with finding that scene. And Roger Craig was pretty much there at the same time as Mooney, just a few minutes after Mooney had discovered the scene. But when Craig saw it, he saw those shells laying side by side. and he called the evidence man to come take pictures of it. And at that time, Roger Craig started looking for the weapon, or possibly, somebody up there on the 6th floor that shot Kennedy. They didn't know at that point. They didn't know really, what was going on. And he says that he was about 8 feet behind another officer who worked for the Dallas Police Department. His name was Officer Eugene Boone. And Eugene Boone called out and said, "Here it is. Here's the weapon. Here's the gun." And Roger was about 8 feet behind him. He walked over to where Boone was standing, and they looked down in between these boxes, and there was a rifle laying between the boxes. And so they called the evidence man, and his name is Lieutenant Day. He came over. He pulled the weapon from the boxes. He looked at it. Then Captain Will Fritz of the Dallas Homicide Division of the police department was on scene, and Day handed the rifle to Fritz. Fritz looked at it. He cocked the gun, ejected one shell out of it, which is, I mean, the police work, it was just so, let's just say, very unprofessional by some of these people. He just, without putting gloves on or anything, he just takes the rifle, cocks it, a shell lands on the ground, and then he says, "Does anybody know what kind of rifle it is?" And at that time, there was a man by the name of Deputy Constable Seymour Weitzman, who had arrived on scene. Now, Deputy Weitzman saw many, many things on the day of the assassination. Now, this identification of the rifle is very important, but I just want to go back for a second. Right after Kennedy was shot, and all these people were running behind the picket fence by the grassy knoll, Seymour Weitzman was one of the officers that went behind the fence, and he was met there by another man who showed him credentials for the Secret Service. He had a gun, and he said, "Everything is under control." Okay. And Weitzman asked for his ID. He looked at it, and it was a Secret Service man. Now, the Secret Service has denied that they had anybody there in that area when Kennedy was killed. Okay. That's a whole nother story. All that stuff's in my book. Yeah. And I go into great detail about it. Now, so Seymour Weitzman, yeah. So back to Seymour Weitzman on the 6th floor, and he says that he can identify the rifle. Captain Fritz hands Weitzman the rifle. He looks at it, he examines it, and he says it's a Mauser. It's a 7.65 Mauser. So everybody out there that's listening, that's familiar with the case, they know that the official story is that Lee Harvey Oswald bought a $13 rifle through a catalog called Klein's using a fake name, Alec Hadell. And supposedly he bought this rifle. I don't believe it for a second. So don't get me wrong, people listening. And the rifle was a 6.5 Italian rifle, a Mannlicher Carcano. That's the rifle that the Warren Commission says that Lee Harvey Oswald and Lee Harvey Oswald alone killed Kennedy with. Now, this rifle that they found on the 6th floor was a 7.65 Mauser. In my book, I print the original affidavit. It's a sworn affidavit that Seymour Weitzman signed the next day. And he was also interviewed by the FBI. And in both reports and in his affidavit, he says that the rifle was a 7.65 Mauser. So apparently Seymour Weitzman didn't get the memo that they had changed the rifle to frame up Lee Harvey Oswald, because that's the one that they used to, use his, I believe it was a P.O. box, supposedly, that he had it mailed to. And yeah. And so that's one of the main things that Roger Craig witnessed there on the 6th floor, the identification of the original rifle that was used to kill Kennedy, one of them, I believe. And the whole Mannlicher Carcano story is a complete fabrication. During that time, while Roger Craig was investigating the crime scene on the 6th floor, he also talks about how one of the officers says that there's been an officer shot in Oak Cliff. Now, that officer turned out to be J.D. Tippett, and instinctively, when this announcement was made, Roger Craig looked at his watch, and his watch read 1:06 p.m. So And there's other corroborating reports of Tippit being killed around between 1:05 and 1:10, which Lee Harvey Oswald, this is another murder that they blamed on this guy. There's no way in heck that he could have ever covered that much ground in a car, flying. No, I may be flying. He could have got there, but he could have never traveled that distance from the school book depository in time to kill Officer Tippit at 1:06 p.m. And so that's another event that Roger witnessed. And this is really what got Roger into trouble. He after they searched the crime scene, Roger went back to his office at the sheriff's office over there on 505 Main Street. He's filling out his report, and he finds out that somebody has been arrested. And he calls over to Captain Fritz's office to tell Fritz that he saw two suspects fleeing, and because he had kind of put some things together that, there was an officer shot in Oak Cliff. He saw these two guys fleeing the school book depository in a direction towards Oak Cliff. And so he called Fritz's office and said, I might have saw, some of the suspects leaving. And so Fritz said, we have somebody in custody and he matches the description that you just gave me. Why don't you come down here and have a look at him? And so Roger Craig goes over to Fritz's office at police headquarters, and he walks into Fritz's office. And as soon as he walks in the office, there he sees Lee Harvey Oswald sitting behind a desk. And Oswald has been, they're interrogating him, and Roger had already explained to Fritz the story about the Rambler, and it was a station wagon. And he tells Fritz, he says, that's the guy I saw. That's the guy I saw. Yeah.
Hold that thought, Steve. Once again, we're up against the break. These segments go by fast. They always do. But anyway, we're going to continue our story after the next break. And we're also going to bring in our other special guest, Roger Dean Craig Jr. So stick around with us. We'll be right back. All right, welcome back, everybody, once again to Inside the Matrix and our next segment here with our guest, Steve Cameron. Steve, you were telling a story that we're all riveted to, so please continue on.
Okay, great. Thanks, Jimmy. So we left off where Roger Craig was in the office of Captain Fritz over at Homicide Division at the Dallas Police Headquarters, and they had arrested a man for the shooting of Officer Tippit. I don't believe they had charged him for the assassination of Kennedy at this point, and we're talking about Lee Harvey Oswald. They had arrested him at the Texas Theater, which was about a half a mile or so from the scene of the Tippit shooting. Lee Harvey Oswald was sitting in the theater. Somebody reported that he had gone into the theater without paying for a ticket, and that's where they arrested Oswald, and then they brought him in for questioning. Now, I'd also like this time, I want to go back to the shooting of Officer Tippit. Now, when Tippit was killed, there were four or five brass shell casings that were found at the scene of the Tippit shooting. And that would suggest that those shells came from an automatic. There was an officer, his name escapes me at the moment. It's J.M. Poe. The shells were turned over to Officer J.M. Poe, and he marked them JMP. He marked two of the shells JMP. Now, Oswald, when he was arrested, he had a .38 revolver on his possession, not an automatic. And when these shells eventually were entered into evidence, Officer Poe was again interviewed about them by the FBI. They came out to his house and they showed him the shells, and he said that he couldn't find his markings on the shells. So the shells that were used to set up Oswald were switched out, and So that's just more evidence of a cover-up. And, they just frame the living crap out of this guy. What Oswald's true role in the assassination, I have my own theories about that, but I don't believe he had anything to do with killing President Kennedy. If anything, he may have been planted as a mole within a group of assassins who he thought possibly he was preventing an assassination attempt. But we'll never know, because there's a guy by the name of Jack Ruby that silenced Lee Harvey Oswald just a couple of days after the assassination. He never got a chance to even talk to an attorney. And so that's very, very strange. And there's also evidence in my book that connects Captain Fritz to Jack Ruby, and possibly Fritz having Jack Ruby kill Lee Harvey Oswald. That's in my book. I have an official FBI document that links the two together. So let's go back to Captain Fritz's office. They're interrogating Lee Harvey Oswald. Roger Craig comes up to the office, and he tells Captain Fritz that that's the man that he saw get into a Rambler station wagon that was being driven by another man. A husky-looking Latin man was driving the station wagon. And when Roger Craig heard that shrill whistle, it was this husky Latin man behind the wheel that was whistling to get somebody's attention. And then that's when he saw Oswald running down the grassy embankment. So that's another reason why this was very strange. He heard the whistle, and he sees this guy. He didn't know it was Oswald at the time, but when he went over to Captain Fritz's office, he sees the guy who he saw leaving in that Rambler station wagon. And so at that time, Fritz turns to Oswald and said, this man, this police officer here, he saw you leave Dealey Plaza with another man in a car. And now this is all according to Craig, okay? Because Captain Fritz, he denied it. He said that he'd never, ever heard of a Roger Craig. He said that an officer never came in his office and identified Oswald as a man fleeing the schoolbook depository in a Rambler. So he said, and now this is Officer Roger Craig, who had won Officer of the Year award just a couple of years earlier. So he was very well known in the community, and Captain Fritz, and respected, Yep. And so, and also there are reports from the day of this identification by Roger Craig of seeing two men fleeing the schoolbook depository, and one of them was Lee Harvey Oswald. Okay, that stuff was in the media the day that it happened, and it was printed in the newspapers, and it's also in Roger Craig's Warren Commission testimony. At least that's one of the things that they left in there. They changed it around slightly, but they literally tampered with his statements. I think they changed his statement something like 15 times. Like there's 15 corrections, that stuff that he never said, or they changed it. You can take a comma and add an and like change the context of everything you say. So they were doing chicanery like that when they brought him in there. They were stopping the tape recorder. When he would start talking about these things, they'd stop the tape recorder and they wouldn't get his testimony on, recorded. Stuff like that. So Fritz turns to Oswald, says, this man saw you leave in a car. According to Craig, Oswald gets upset and he says, I told you people I left. That station wagon belongs to Mrs. Payne. Okay. He didn't say car. He said station wagon. Okay. He was never asked about a station wagon. Fritz turned to him and said, this man saw you leave in a car. Oswald immediately identifies that car as being a station wagon, says, I told you people I left. That station wagon belongs to Mrs. Payne. Don't try to drag her into this. Now, the Mrs. Payne that he's talking about is a woman named Ruth Payne, who's Oswald's wife was staying with, I believe in Irvine, Texas. And Mrs. Payne, the story goes that she was studying Russian, and So that's how she met Lee Harvey Oswald's wife, who was Russian, because he had supposedly had defected. I believe he was working for the U.S. government as a spy, and he was sent over to Russia to spy on the Russians. And he met a woman over there, Aunt Marina, his wife, and they got married. And then he came back to the States. Russia kicked him out of the country. She came back to the States with Oswald, and they were living in New Orleans area. And then Marina went to go live with Ruth Payne outside of Dallas, and that's how Ruth Payne knew the Oswalds. And that's why her name came up in this. Now, if you look into Ruth Payne's past, there are some very interesting things about Ruth Payne and her husband, who works for Bell Helicopter. And so there's some very strange things, in my opinion, that were going on with the Paynes. I believe that they were Oswald's handlers. And maybe one of the reasons why Oswald was rumored and seen, actually witnessed driving her car. Now, she did not own a Rambler station wagon. She owned a 1955 Chevy station wagon. And Oswald was reported in the area, witnessed driving this station wagon by himself to certain locations, like getting his hair cut. People saw him driving up to shooting ranges and things like that. But the official story is that Oswald couldn't drive and he didn't have a driver's license. And Ruth Payne was hauled into FBI headquarters, and she was asked about this. And they asked her about her station wagon and if Oswald ever drove it, and she said no. She never let Oswald drive her car or anything like that. So there's some very strange things going on with the Ruth Payne's association with Lee Harvey Oswald.
And who was the burly guy driving the Rambler?
Well, I do name some individuals who I believe were in that car. They are in the book, The Deputy Interviews. And these are suspects that were working for a group called Interpin, International Penetration Force, which was an anti-Castro group in the 1960s. They were being funded by the CIA to infiltrate.
Course.
Yes. They were being used to infiltrate pro-Castro groups and things like that. And I don't know if you or your listeners have ever heard of something called Operation Northwoods.
Yes. From
the 1960s.
Oh, yeah.
Which was a plan to shoot down an airliner over just near Cuba and blame it on the Cubans. And they were going to stage all these things on U.S. soil, blowing things up and killing people in the streets and things like that, pretending to be pro-Castro and, at the order of Castro. So I believe this group Interpin would have been involved in that, at least on some level. But Kennedy wouldn't sign that order. The Joint Chiefs of Staff brought it to him, and he said, "Are you crazy? I'm not signing this." And so they never got their plan to kind of like a mini 9/11. That was like a 9/11 before 9/11, if you want to talk about false flags and things like that. But this would have been a false flag. They were going to pretend to either kill. They were either going to kill people or pretend to kill them. I mean, it's all in this document, Operation Northwoods, how they were going to load up the plane with CIA personnel and stage their deaths and have all their contacts in the media sell it to the American people. I mean, they were talking about this stuff back in the 60s. And this is just some of the stuff that's been released, declassified, so who knows some of the stuff that, I'm sure the 9/11 plan is going to come out someday. Maybe, if, who knows if they're dumb enough to, have not destroyed all the evidence at this point. So let's go back to Roger Craig and some of these people that were involved now. I do name some of these individuals. I believe the person that was driving the Rambler station wagon, and Roger Craig was actually shown a picture of this guy by Jim Garrison. Now, Roger Craig went on to work with Jim Garrison, who was trying to prosecute Clay Laverne Shaw for involvement in the Kennedy assassination case. And if it's okay with you, before we go too far into the story, I'd like to bring in somebody, a special somebody. I'd like to bring in Roger Craig Jr., if that's okay at this point.
Yeah, that'd be great. And great to have you on, Roger. Thank you. I wanted to ask you, you were probably a young man when all this went down. Do you remember your dad coming home that day, and what happened? What did he say?
He came home. We were living over in East Dallas at the time, and his wife went and got him a glass of tea, and he sat down in his chair with a glass of tea, and then I kept hearing him say, "It's not right. It's not right." And his wife asked him, "What's not right?" And he said, "The investigation, they're not doing it correctly." And that's all he said at that time.
Okay.
See, my father was the type of person that, if something happens, he's going to try to figure out everything he can about it.
Mm-hmm.
And he would only tell the truth, because he figured if a person lies about something, then they must be a criminal.
Mm-hmm.
That's the way he was. And I had my bicycle stolen one time while we were living there, and I told him a description of the guy that I thought took it, and I had it chained up, but they cut the chain. And the next day, my father comes home with my bicycle.
Wow.
And he said, "Double chain it next time." That's all he said. And I said, "Yes, sir."
Wow. So, Roger, you went on to become a deputy sheriff in the Dallas Sheriff's Office later yourself, right?
Yes, I did. I'll tell you how it worked. I was sworn in on February 14th, and I walked into the old warrants department where my father worked, after he left patrol.
Mm-hmm.
And one of his, I guess you say, old-time friends was sitting there with his feet up on the desk, and I walked in, and he fell out of his chair on the floor. And I went over to help him up, and he said, "Who are you?" I said, "I'm Roger Dean Craig Jr." He said, "I thought your father's ghost had just walked in."
Oh, wow.
So that's
how much they look alike. They look when they were young.
Well, see, when my father was 24, he took a picture while he was in the Decker Sheriff's Office. And then I've got a picture of me when I was 24, and I believe Steve has it also. And we look almost identical, except he had brown eyes and I had blue eyes.
Wow. Okay. Steve, why don't you ask Roger a couple of questions that he gave you information about before?
Yeah, sure. So as far as what your dad's witnessed that day, Roger, did he ever have any doubts about any of the stuff that he saw? I mean, did he believe that there was a conspiracy to kill Kennedy pretty much from day one? I know you said that he said it wasn't right, but as time went on, could you tell us what led to his firing at the sheriff's office? Because, like I was telling Jimmy earlier about his identification of Oswald in Fritz's office, Fritz went on to say that he'd never heard of Roger Craig. He'd never, nobody ever came in his office and identified Oswald with a conspirator, fleeing the scene or anything like that, because that proves conspiracy. I mean, two or more people. I mean, and your father witnessed that. What were his thoughts about that?
Well, one, he proved that Fritz was wrong, because somehow, somewhere, a photographer took a picture looking through the glass into Fritz's office.
Oh.
And there was my father standing beside Fritz, and at the table with Oswald sitting in it.
Yeah, and I believe you're talking about Chief Curry. Yeah, Chief Curry. He was even
had that picture in there.
Yeah, he was even interviewed that day of the assassination, and he doesn't name your father, but he says, an officer spotted Lee Harvey Oswald fleeing the scene in a Rambler station wagon. And, your father, like his testimony in the Warren Commission, he talks about it. It's in the FBI report that he went down there. I think your father gave a sworn statements to the FBI a day or two after the assassination, and it's right in there. He went in there and he identified Oswald. Now, where a lot of confusion kind of comes into it is whether or not it could have been Oswald that he saw running from the school book depository. And I'm leaving that kind of open. I'm being very open-minded about it. I believe pretty much to your dad's dying day, he always believed it was Oswald, but there were very credible reports that there were lookalikes who were framing Oswald, and this goes back to members of the group called Interpen, the CIA-funded anti-Castro group they were infiltrating pro-Castro organizations and things like that. And one of these members was going around telling people that he was a hitman for the CIA, and his name was Lee Harvey Oswald. And he looked like Oswald too. And I print his picture in the book as well. Your everything I've read about the stuff that your father witnessed, and there's also corroboration for. Like there's a man by the name of Marvin Robinson who also said that there was a man identical to Oswald running from the school book depository and get into a station wagon and flee the scene. I believe I've found in there, all of them are in the book, up to about 12 witnesses that witnessed what your father did, but none of them had their credentials of your father. Your father was a decorated police officer who had won Officer of the Year award just a couple of years before. And, so they had to discredit him, and many others, many other people who testified to the Warren Commission had their testimonies tampered with as well. But I'll go ahead. I just want to hear your thoughts on that, Roger.
Well, when my father explained to people what he saw and how the investigation was going, he figured out that somebody, didn't know who, was leading the way through the investigation instead of gathering evidence. Because there were several people my father stopped that day and turned them over to another officer, and they were never reported.
Right.
And also, like with the weapon that was found up there. It was a Mauser with a side sling, which German Mausers have side slings. And an Italian Mannlicher Carcano has bottom sling holes. So that's two different guns.
Yeah, right here, the officer that found the weapon, Officer Eugene Boone, right in his police report from the day of, he says the rifle appeared to be a 7.65 Mauser with a telescopic sight on the rifle.
Didn't they take pictures of that too?
Yeah, there's pictures of the rifle that's seen in between the boxes, and then some pictures of them holding it up. See, whether or not there's a lot of confusion when those pictures were actually taken. There's a lot, evidence to support that a lot of pictures that were taken of the crime scene were actually later in the afternoon, like a couple of hours. Because if you see the crime scene photos, the shells that Roger Craig saw lying side by side, they're scattered. Okay, so yeah. Whether they were scattered accidentally, maybe somebody came in there and kicked them by accident, and then the pictures were taken, or they were like somebody in on it. It was like, what the hell? This looks too obvious. We got to
adjust it a little bit.
Adjust it a little bit. And there's also reports of multiple rifles being found. I believe Robert Groden, who I also interview for the book, he talks about another rifle that was found on the roof of the school book depository and was handed down the fire escape to another officer. And there's photos of it in Robert Groden's book. Yeah.
All right. Hold that thought, Steve. We're coming up
Sure.
on another hard break here. And once again, we're flying by. And we're going to take a short pause right here. We'll be back with our continuing story with Steve Cameron and Roger Dean Craig Jr. We'll be right back.
You're listening to Inside the Matrix.
All right. Welcome back, everybody, to Inside the Matrix with our guests, Steve Cameron and former deputy sheriff from Dallas, Roger Dean Craig Jr. Now, Roger, I was curious about the last time you saw your father. What was his demeanor? What was it like at that time?
Well, I'd been married about 13 months. I was 17 years old. His granddaughter had just been born, and my wife, me, and my his granddaughter, we went over to his house. And him and his wife was still married at the time. And I come in, and his wife invited us in, grabbed the baby and everything. And I said, come here and look at your granddaughter. He looked at me. He said, son, you need to leave and take your family with you. I didn't understand at the time why he was that way. But when I got the phone call after I came back from Germany and got a divorce from my wife at the time and got custody of my two girls, when I got the phone call that he was dead, and then I heard the circumstances of it and went and claimed the body and saw the body and everything, I knew why he had told me to leave when I was 17 and not come back and take my family with me. Because when I got that phone call that he was dead, I was 21 years old then. And there wasn't a rifle in the house, so how could he shoot himself with a rifle? And when I picked up the body, he had bruises on his knees, abrasions on his wrist, and the way the bullet went, it went from right to left in a downward angle. And the rifle was laying on the bed, and he was laying in the middle of the floor, face down, where he bled out. And the only weapons he had was a .357 Magnum, which is a revolver pistol, and his Colt Combat Commander, which is an automatic .45.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know how he could shoot himself and have all the direction of the bullet and the bruises on him and all that. So I got to thinking that the reason he told me to leave when I was 17 is he knew that they were going to be coming after him again.
Mm-hmm. So there were, did you find out that they had multiple attempts on your father's life?
Yes, there was 5 and the last one got him.
Yeah, the first one, Roger, if it's okay if I can jump in here for a second. So your father had left the sheriff's office in, what was it, 1966, 1967? Because Sheriff Decker had ordered all of his deputies not to talk about the assassination or what they saw. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Now, your father was being interviewed by reporters in the early days, right after the assassination, and they were asking him about that story about seeing Oswald and all this stuff that had happened that day that he saw. And so he was giving interviews to these people, and from all accounts, Sheriff Decker was not happy about it. Is that correct?
That is correct. According to my father, Decker called him into the office. Of course, the office had moved over on Commerce Street by that time at the government building on the other side of the Red Courthouse. They'd left the Decker jail and went over there because they built a new building. And he called him in the office, and he says, "You've been talking to people." Now, this is what my father told us.
Mm-hmm.
And he said, "No, sir, I haven't." And he said, "Well, somebody sure to hell has. You no longer work here. I'm sorry that you have to put your resignation in."
Yeah. And this was after the Warren Commission had wrapped everything up and blamed everything on Oswald at this point. And then it was around 1966 that Jim Garrison announced that he was putting Clay Shaw on trial for involvement. And it was people that were working for Jim Garrison's office that had contacted Roger about what he had seen. And this got back to Decker, because I believe there were stories being printed in newspapers and stuff, some of the details that Roger witnessed. And there was also photographs of what I told you about earlier, Jimmy, about the bullet that had been found near the manhole cover there on the south side of Elm Street with the blood and everything. Now, if it's okay, I'd like to talk about that for a minute. It's very important. In the same book that Roger mentioned earlier that Chief Curry had written, he prints that picture, and right in the picture he says Deputy Buddy Walters and an FBI man examining where a bullet had struck, the curb. And there's the picture, and there were several pictures taken by newspaper photographers, and it shows a man, looks like an FBI agent, walks over, and Buddy Walters is right there, and he bends down, and it looks like he picks something up. And then there's another picture, it shows him holding it in his hand, and he walks away with it. Now, Buddy Walters told several people that there was a bullet there, that an FBI man walked over, picked it up, and just walked away with it. Okay, all this information is in the book. I'm not going to go into great detail, but that's all in the book. And that's also where Roger Craig had, he saw this also take place in this area. There were a couple of other witnesses, and their names were Wayne and Edna Hartman. And they were also there, and they described seeing two bullet streaks in the grass, and they were about 18 to 24 inches long. And they look like, where bullets had hit in the grass, and they were in line with the grassy knoll, picket fence area.
That's like perpendicular to the book depository, right? So it couldn't come from there.
No, but you know what the FBI did? The Hartmans went to the FBI. The FBI didn't go to them. They went to the FBI with their story. They were both interviewed. And I print their FBI documents in my book. The FBI changed their story from 2 bullet streaks at the ground to 1 that was in line with the 6th floor of the school book depository, and said that it wasn't a bullet; it was a piece of the president's skull had burrowed into the ground. And yes, and since that FBI report, those documents and things like that had been published through the National Archives, the Hartmans, started doing interviews, and they're interviewed, and I have their interview in my book, where they talk about that the FBI was not interested in their story. They completely changed their story from 2 bullets to 1, and then said it was a piece of the president's skull that did it, in line with the 6th floor of the school book depository. So that's some more chicanery that was going on there with evidence testimony. But yeah, so Roger Craig was getting phone calls from Jim Garrison's office about what he knew, and it got back to Sheriff Decker. Sheriff Decker fired Roger in 67. And then at that point, Roger said, well, I don't have anything else to lose, basically. And so he told Jim Garrison that he would travel to New Orleans for a deposition. And I believe, Roger Jr., you were with your father at that time when your father went to New Orleans for the deposition in Jim Garrison's case?
We were all there. We stayed in a hotel, and some guys come up and took my father, and they drove off, and I don't know how long it was before he came back, but we were just staying in a hotel there at New Orleans, and Jim Garrison paid for the hotel room, so that's where we were at. I think I was 13. I think I just had my 13th birthday around then.
And then you guys went back to Dallas after the deposition, and that was when the first attempt on your dad's life took place. I think your dad wrote about it in his book, When They Kill a President, which is also printed in my book, The Deputy Interviews. He talks about that situation. After he got back from giving his deposition to Garrison, he received a phone call from somebody who he thought was his friend, and this friend of his said that he needed to talk to Roger. He had some very important information to give him. And so Roger agreed to meet with him at a Waffle House on Carroll Street in Dallas. When Roger left his house, he saw what he called his tails, okay, because he was being followed, he was being monitored. He knew this. He had reel-to-reel set up and stuff like that on his phone. Back then, they were, record these things on reel-to-reels. Right. Because he was getting threats. People were calling his house, telling him to keep his mouth shut. And so he agreed to meet with this so-called friend of his. I believe his name was Bill. And he met with him at this Waffle House. The guy that called him Bill never told Roger why he had called him up there. And then he abruptly ended the meeting before he would, told him why he wanted to meet with Roger. And at the same time, when Roger was driving up there, he said that there was a man following him, and then he parked his car and saw the man driving around the block. And then when he went into the Waffle House to meet with his friend, this same man came into the diner and took a seat on a bar stool there, in the diner. And his friend Bill said, "Hey, I gotta go. I'll talk to you some other time." And he got up to leave. And then the same man that had followed them in got up and left before they could leave the Waffle House. And then when Roger and Bill were walking out to their cars, his friend was trying to get away from him and was walking away from him, trying to get away from him. And then all of a sudden, he fell down on the ground by his car and started crawling away. And Roger thought that he had tripped and fell. And so Roger stepped off the curb to help him up. And right when he stepped off the curb, he heard a crack and felt a burning sensation on the side of his head. So somebody had shot at him at that point. I'll let Roger go ahead and pick up the story about that. What happened after that, Roger?
Well, he came home, and he had a little crease in his hairline on the left side, and looked like it was burnt there. And he said they tried to kill me. And there was a reporter that came to the house because we were living in East Dallas at that time. And the reporter, I recognized his voice when I opened the door. He knocked on the door, and I opened the door, and he said, "I'd like to speak to Roger Craig." And I said, "Okay, let me get my father." And I called my father, and I recognized the reporter's voice. He had a radio station in Dallas, which we listened to radio all the time back then. And his name was Paul Harvey. And my father asked my stepmother to take all of us kids and go off for a little while. And my stepmother loved to go to garage sales, so that's what we did for about 3 or 4 hours. And when we came back, the reporter was gone, and my father locked the door. He had put a lock on this one room where he had his reel-to-reel, and he locked that door so we couldn't go in there. And that was about it.
Yeah, so your dad felt that that was retaliation for his deposition for Garrison. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Yeah, and at that time,
he did an interview right after that, and the person interviewing him on film, and we saw it on TV. He never did come in the picture. You could just hear him asking questions, and my father telling, what had happened and everything. Everything you just explained, he told this interviewer.
Right, and he had contacted Garrison's office right after that happened. This is Roger, he explained all this in his book, When They Kill a President. And Jim Garrison had been working with Penn Jones during that time, and Roger had never met him up to that point. And Jim Garrison sent Penn Jones over to Roger's house. And that's when they started communicating and working very closely with Jim Garrison's investigation. Roger he went back to New Orleans to testify in the Clay Shaw trial. Another deputy that was called to testify was Buddy Walters about that bullet that was found there, and what he reported as an FBI agent walked up and picked it up and walked away with it. Unfortunately, Buddy Walters didn't get a chance to testify because he was murdered less than a month before he was scheduled to testify for Garrison's trial. He was sent on a case, supposedly I think it was an escaped prisoner at a hotel, and he walked in a hotel room, and the person that they were trying to apprehend shot him and killed him conveniently in time, so he couldn't testify for Garrison's trial about what he saw.
Steve, let me ask you this. Has anybody ever counted up the number of people who were taken out as a result of trying to cover up what happened?
Yeah, one of them is Penn Jones. Penn Jones put together a list, and he's written books on the case as well, and he also talks about Roger. He talks about Roger's case in his books, Forgive My Grief. He has four volumes of that. And he put a list together, I think in the 80s, early 1980s, and over 100 people connected with the case. Very mysterious circumstances. We could do a whole show on that. I mean, we really could.
Sounds kind of like Hillery's trail.
Oh, yes. Vince Foster.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. Well, yeah, and there were many before him in Arkansas.
Yeah.
Oh, this is how they operate. Unfortunately for all of us who do try to seek the truth.
And that's
these people have no rules. There are no laws. They just do whatever they need to do to protect their interests, whatever they may be, for nefarious purposes. And even today, we see that in Congress. We see all the pay for play and the kickbacks and all these things that these guys have been riding the gravy train for so long. We see it all coming out, but then we see them covering it up too. And we see witnesses disappearing. This is an ongoing thing. And, as American people, we've got to get a handle on this. We've got to find some honest people that are willing to, get in these positions and do something about it. And right now, it doesn't seem like we have too many.
Well, yeah, J. Gary Shaw, who I also interviewed for the book, he kind of explained it as there were three waves of deaths shortly after the JFK assassination and leading up to the Warren Commission report. And leading up to Jim Garrison's trial in the late 60s, and then also leading up to the House Select Committee on Assassinations in the 1970s. And I believe that Roger Craig was a victim of that because he would have been a key witness to their investigation. And Robert Garodin, he confided that in me. When I interviewed him, he said that Roger would have been a key witness and called before the committee for what he knew. And many people died leading up to that, including Sam Giancana, Johnny Roselli. Many people. Even there was a woman who she interviewed, Jack Ruby. I believe she got the only interview with Jack Ruby. And after she interviewed him, she said that she was going to break the case wide open. And Dorothy Kilgallen, I believe her name is, and I talk about her a little bit in the book. and she was killed very mysteriously as well. So yeah, it's same thing. You know, when these type of events happen, you know, even 9/11, after 9/11 happened, many people started dropping like flies after that. Including, and if people don't want to believe in these conspiracies, I mean, look, right after 9/11, you know, the EPA said that the air was safe to in ground zero. You know, everybody go back to work. You know, everything's back to normal, and the air was toxic.
Sure.
You know, and so people, you know, got all kinds of illnesses and have died from that, you know, on those lies alone. So, you know, to think that the government wouldn't, you know, pull off some events to, you know, forward their agenda, whether it's war or to make money or sell drugs, it's really not that far of a stretch. Or, you know, assassinate a president like John Kennedy. And many people wanted Kennedy dead because Kennedy, one of the things, you know, that I believe that he was murdered for was because he wouldn't support an invasion into Cuba to remove Castro because of the threat coming from Russia, and to avoid a nuclear war, a nuclear conflict with Russia. You know, he didn't want to do that, and so I believe that was one of the reasons why he was taken out, because there were some people that, you know, wanted to go to war. Mm-hmm. Wanted to remove Castro, and they didn't care how many Americans would have to be killed.
Well, before Castro came along, you know, Cuba was the playground of the deep state, basically, and organized crime. You know, they basically had their way with that whole country until that happened. So they wanted to get back to business. Yeah. And of course, war is always big business in general. War is the most profitable business there is, and next to banking, of course.
Yeah, I think the first thing that Johnson did when he got into office was to reverse an order that he was pulling advisors out of Vietnam. And the first thing I believe Johnson did was reverse that order and escalated the involvement there. And then next thing, you have the Gulf of Tonkin incident.
Which we later learned never happened.
Yeah. Yeah, but that lie got something like 60,000, 70,000 U.S. Soldiers killed, including 2 million South Vietnamese. But yeah, so Roger Craig, he also paid the ultimate price for for the truth that he tried to bring to the world, and several attempts he did have on his life after he was shot at. I believe the next time he was trying to get information for Jim Garrison's case, and somebody wanted to meet with him, and they took him out to this place. And when Roger went back to his car, he tried to turn it over, and the car exploded. Luckily, he survived it. But he had to go to the hospital and get stitches, and he was banged up from that. And then they tried to run him off a mountain road when he was working as a private investigator he made his living as a private investigator after he left the sheriff's office. He was also justice of the peace.
All right. Once again, our time has run out. Thank you so much, Steve Cameron. People, you can find him on stevecameronproductions.com. And thank you, Roger Dean Craig Jr., for being our guest today.
You're welcome.
Amazon, Jimmy, you can get the book, The Deputy Interviews, on Amazon.com. Thank you so much for having us on today. I really, really appreciate it.
Okay. I appreciate you, gentlemen. Keep up the good fight. And till next week, you've been listening to Inside the Matrix. Catch you later, people.
This is Inside the Matrix, hosted by Jimmy Brent.
Who are we talking about?
Jimmy Brent. Live every Sunday, 3 p.m. Pacific, 6 p.m. Eastern. Exclusively on the KCOR Digital Radio Network.
It is worldwide.
Broadcasting from an undisclosed location deep within the neon capital of the world, Las Vegas, Nevada. For more information on the host and the show, please visit InsideTheMatrix.org. That's InsideTheMatrix.org. It's time to break the chains of manipulated consciousness and claim our true nature as creative, divine beings. Inside the Matrix. Inside the Matrix.
This is KCOR Las Vegas, home of the Digital Radio Network, broadcasting from a shack just south of Area 51.
Wait, that doesn't exist.
This is the KCOR Digital Radio Network. Now for the news.